Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Interact Salon with John Ganz. I think there are a lot of newcomers and also some staunch OG Interact members. So this is going to be a very good combination where we can really share very different opinions about where this beautiful country that most of us reside in might be going. Let me just see. There's somebody struggling to get in. My name is Anna Gatt. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the founder and CEO of Interinteract. I think this is the third time that, John, you are on the platform. You were
Yeah.
first on with Max Reed, and then you went
Yep.
into Ideas of Power in October 2024 when you were on
hmm
the panel with Julia Zonabend, right? Do I remember
Yes.
correctly?
Yes. Yep.
That was fantastic. Today is going to be a more focused conversation when we will discuss John's book from last year, with the special twist that kind of a lot has happened since then, maybe more than in a usual year in American politics. I think
Sure.
people feel a little bit PTSD ridden and that we're in some kind of accelerated timeline. It remains to be seen whether this is a good timeline or not a good timeline. This event is going to be going is that we will discuss when the clock broke, conmen, conspiracists, and how America cracked up in the early 90s. John and I we will speak a little bit at the beginning, explore some of the big themes of the book. But then
Sure.
this is an interact salon, and I'm going to open the floor, and you are all welcome to jump in and, in a spirit of respect and mutual understanding, ask your questions, make your notes. If you don't want to be in the recording, as you can see, this is being recorded. You can hide your video. I really, really love video because I would love to see you. It's helpful for me as a moderator to see when you're falling asleep and when you're like super excited. You're very welcome to introduce yourself in the Zoom chat. You can also ask a question in the Zoom chat if you don't want to necessarily raise your hand, although I really welcome everybody to do so. And then at our own discretion, we might read up that question or kind of weave it into the conversation. So these are kind of the ground rules. Imagine that you are in my living room. I am in my living room. So this is really a salon. We're here to kind of figure out what is going on and, most importantly, what John thinks about it and what he might have changed his mind about in the past year. Hi, John. How are you doing in
I'm
this
doing very well. Thanks for
at the
having
end of
me.
this crazy year? What's going on with
Yeah.
you?
Well, I'm doing okay. Obviously, the country is facing a lot of difficult moments, but personally, I'm all right. It's very cold here in New York. I haven't left the house all day.
I'm
So
in leg warmers for full transparency. You guys can't see it. I'm only elegant from the waist up, and below that it's ski outfit.
yeah, I'm in my shearling slippers if anybody wants to know.
But we survived. We somehow survived 2025, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Which was not necessarily fully obvious when you were
No.
writing this book. So obviously, I don't know how much you guys know about me. I'm not American. I'm based here in New York City. So for me, reading When the Clock Broke was not just an interesting instance of time travel, but also kind of elucidating a period in American history that was, I think, not truly as kind of transparently understandable from the outside as is
Yeah.
American politics today, right? When on Twitter,
Yeah.
everybody knows when like Donald Trump has indigestion. That was not
hmm
at all the case in the early 90s. But like John, I am myself also a 90s kid
Right.
grew up or grew into this era that was both kind of socially dark, but also idyllic and booming and very hope
Yeah.
post. I mean, I'm Eastern European, so I lived through
Sure.
the Cold War there. So what makes this period so special? I mean, you dedicate an entire book to this early 90, like 80, from 89 to 92. What
Yeah.
happened there?
It's interesting. I mean, there's the 90s of memory and then there's the 90s of history. And obviously, I think, looking back, especially in the United States, and I think in Europe to a certain extent too, the 1990s is remembered as a, very prosperous time, a peaceful time for the most part, where the US was doing well, seemed to be the sole dominant power in the world, economically was doing great. But my book focuses on kind of a little micro period that I identified between 1989 and I would say 1993, where the tone was quite different. If you look at what was going on in the country during that time period, and you read the newspapers and you look at political commentary, Um, the Cold War is ending. The United States should be in a place that feels very good about itself, and its position in the world. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot of worry, and there's a lot of actual, I wouldn't say panic, but a sense that there was something seriously wrong in the country. Okay, so why was that? First of all, you had a recession, from the point of view of us who have lived through the great, financial crisis. It doesn't look like much. This is not on the same level, but it's kind of a micro version of it. You have a highly financialized section of the economy, in this case, commercial real estate, not personal real estate, begun has a bubble and then crashes. And throughout the 1980s, you saw the incomes of middle class people stagnate. You saw a lot of the beginnings of deindustrialization. And along with this, you see a growing distrust in the political system, um, that comes to a head as Reagan leaves office and Bush enters office. The savings and loan crisis explodes. The U.S. wins the Cold War, but that's a kind of strange victory because an enormous amount of government spending was going on that was buoying, the U.S. economy, and was sort of, there was a lot of manufacturing, defense contracting, aerospace. So, for instance, if you look on paper, you say, "Wow, this doesn't look like such a great big recession." And then if you look at, say, what's going on in LA County or in the areas around Los Angeles, you have basically like something like a quarter of all jobs are lost. And the aerospace industry there, which was huge during the Cold War, just kind of disappears. So then when you see something like the Rodney King riots, you have to keep, and which looks like such an strange explosion of violence. Yeah, but you have to remember that this is kind of happening in a section of country that's going through a miniature Great Depression. So you have an enormous amount of these different pressure points. And then so there's these structural issues. And then you start to see strange things emerging in politics. In 1989, it was the day, I think it was the day that Bush was inaugurated. Bush was obviously the successor of Reagan. You have David Duke becomes a state legislator in Louisiana. David Duke, of course, was a former member of the head of the Ku Klux, Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, and neo-Nazi. And this is just the beginning of a kind of political run that he does that really spooks the GOP. And they're throwing everything they have at him, but he's consistently winning every single race, but he's coming in first in GOP primaries and getting large amounts and sometimes a majority of the white vote against the wishes of the institutional GOP, and they can't stop it. Again, while the rest of the country was booming, Louisiana was in a little different state. I mean, they had an oil slump in the 1980s, which benefited everybody else in the country, but was not great for people in Louisiana. So kind of what everybody else experienced in the rest of the country hits Louisiana first. So you see this kind of strange political phenomenon going on. And then a lot of people on Reagan's right are observing this, and they've not exactly thought of I think among liberals and leftists, they think of the Reagan years as a terrific and resounding and almost success for the right and a rout for the left. But there is a right of Reagan who believed that Reaganism was swallowed up by institutional mainstream liberalism in Washington, D.C., and they were not happy with the way things went. So the success or the relative success of Duke in Louisiana is a kind of signal that they think there is, in the words of Pat Buchanan, a big vacuum, a big political vacuum to the right of Ronald Reagan. And Pat Buchanan launches a primary campaign against Ronald Reagan from the right, and it is very different from Reagan's version of conservatism. It is protectionist. It is anti-immigration. Reagan's last speech was obviously, talking about the city on the hill, still thinking of America as a nation of immigrants. Buchanan rejects that. Is openly nationalist. So it's sort of a rejection of a lot of the what had been the common wisdom of the center right up to that point. What else do you have going on in this period? Well, you have big changes in the media. You have the rise of talk radio. So you have where before, because of FCC constraints and ownership limitations, you don't have these nationwide political all-day talk stations. That begins to happen. You also have the rise of cable news, which is something I unfortunately did not emphasize enough in my book. So I think you can kind of begin to see where I'm going with all this. You have on multiple different levels the hints of the kinds of structural transformations and emergence of different politics. You have a fragmenting of the media. You have the breakdown of the kind of post-war um, compromise between labor and capital, which, created a relatively decent life for most middle class people. And at the same time, you have the emergence of a national populist conservatism that's sort of assaulting the mainstream of the GOP and even the mainstream of the Conservative Party from its right. And then you have a kind of wild card, Ross Perot, who is not really from the conservative movement. You could say he's kind of a right-wing phenomenon, and he is a billionaire. He criticizes both parties for being incompetent and being in the pocket of special interests, and he wants to apply business practices and engineering practices to improve the federal government. Now, never mind what the Constitution says. And he wants the United States to adopt, and he's very worried about foreign trade. He's looking at the success of Germany and the success of Japan and their export-driven economies. And he wants to kind of have a closer relationship between, he's a big capitalist, but he's not much of a free marketer. He thinks that the US government and industry have too oppositional of a relationship, and he kind of wants to see something like they have in Japan, where you have a government kind of protecting national champions, or Taiwan, something like that. And there is an authoritarian streak to his. In retrospect, it looks pretty quaint and innocent and harmless. But at the time, people noted there was a very strong authoritarian streak to both his leadership style and some of the things he was saying on the campaign trail. Now, he was not as racially incendiary as, say, Duke or Buchanan, but he definitely kind of attacks. He sort of simultaneously attacks both parties from the left and right. He also makes a big case about the deficit as being kind of a proxy for everything that's going on in the United States economy. Now, it's easy to forget that at some points in this election, it looked like Ross Perot could actually win. At some points, the polling has him ahead of both major parties. Now, he's very erratic. The media starts to attack him. He kind of calls it quit, gets frustrated, calls it quits. But, people wonder what might have happened had he stayed in the race and not done this. And in the end, he comes up with almost 20% of the vote, the best showing of a third party candidate since Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. So, yeah, again, you begin to see for this brief period a lot of the different features that would typify American politics and society in the 21st century. A lot of the issues: trade, immigration, a kind of populist attack on the mainstreams of both parties, a fragmentation of the media, a public that was rejecting the establishment across academia, across politics, the media, and this concerns people. And they say, "Oh, something is happening in the country. We're heading into strange times." Clinton wins the election. The United States economy improves greatly. The 90s obviously extremely successful. Some of the things that looked Like they were stuck. Like productivity in the country was very low. Paul Krugman, wrote a book in the 1990s called in the early 90s called The Age of Diminished Expectations. And his attitude was basically, look, we don't know what's wrong with the US economy, and we're not sure if we're ever going to get out of this. And then, the personal computer comes out, the dot-com stuff comes in. It seems like things are going to be okay. And obviously, a lot of the trends that started in the 1980s, say deregulation of finance, where you see this first big problems with it, with the savings and loan crisis and the commercial real estate crash. That kind of continues through Clinton. There's a very interesting book that came out called Fabulous Failure by Lichtenstein Stein, which kind of complicates the picture of the Clinton administration. Everyone, the standard left liberal and left wing critique of the Clinton administration is, oh, they were neoliberal sellouts, and they sold American workers down the drain and sold out to Wall Street. And not exactly true. I mean, it was more complicated than that. There was a side of the Clinton administration, because you guys all know Robert Reich and all these people, who were more, let's say, socially democratic. And then there were
Oops, John, you froze.
um, then you have a kind of larger repetition of some of the structures I think I identified in the book. So instead of, the limited damage of the savings and loan crisis, you have the massive cataclysm of the great financial crisis. And instead of the relative fragmentation you see with cable TV and talk radio, you have the kind of real fragmentation that you see with the internet. Um, and instead of, you know, these political insurgencies of the populist right kind of making trouble in primaries and kind of temporarily giving the elites of the parties a scare before kind of fading into nothing, these things really burst out.
Hmm.
So, I just thought it was so fascinating when I began the research for the book that I found this kind of microscopic or microcosm version of what repeated in a much larger form. And I almost felt like it was, I almost had a natural scientific metaphor that I wanted to use where, things happen so fast these days and are so confusing, and are just so overwhelming to the senses, that kind of looking at it in a previous era where, we're still in the world of the newspaper and the radio, and yeah, cable news is existing, but it's a little easier to parse and a little easier still to follow things. So it seemed like a wonderful opportunity to kind of slow things down and see the origins of some of the things that would develop and crystallize in this present time. And then, what I thought was kind of uncanny was Donald Trump kind of was this crystallization of all these different things going on. I mean, I talk about shock radio jocks, obviously, and tabloid journalism. Obviously, Donald Trump comes straight out of that world. He's a guest on Howard Stern all the time. He's very much in his affect and the way he does politics. He's very much of that world. He's aware of Pat Buchanan and David Duke in this era. He's kind of watching them from the sidelines. He comes out of a similar tradition, if you want to call it that. He has similar instincts about trade. His attitudes about immigration kind of hardened later,
Yeah.
I would say, but he definitely had protectionist instincts very early. And obviously kind of very, let's say, hardline attitudes about crime. Um, and he seemed to me
And
like,
he's a
okay,
landowner in some kind of fundamental way, right? I mean,
yeah,
as far as New York real estate goes.
yeah. And I have a chapter in the book on John Gotti, who became kind of a folk hero in this time period in the New York tabloids. Um, so if you kind of layer everything in the book on top of each other, if you layer the shock jocks, Ross Perot, this billionaire populist, David Duke, this kind of sleek, slick, but you know, Nazi, Pat Buchanan coming out with this extremely hardcore anti-protectionist and anti-immigration message, you kind of can see Donald Trump through it all, and he, in a weird way, he embodied all the things you see separately and he kind of brought them all together. Showbiz, this right-wing populist, um, revolt against party elites in the mainstream. So yeah, that was when I was going through for the book. And when I wrote it, it was before it came out in the summer of 2024, and I had no idea Trump was going to win. And I thought the book was going to be maybe of antiquarian, uh, interest, especially because of some of the kind of obscure ideologues I write about, people like Murray Rothbard and Sam Francis. Um, so I didn't think I was wondering how the book would fare if people would be interested in it, and it turned out, from my perspective, unfortunately, to be relevant. Uh, I wrote a I wrote a postscript of the book after the election when the paperback came out, kind of trying to bring the book up to the present. And this was in the days of Doge. And I was just struck by, and I had no idea. I mean, I wrote in my own writing after, when I was working on the book and a little bit after, I wrote about Elon Musk and the tech politics stuff. And I could see there was a connection between Ross Perot, who, by the way, it was a tech billionaire of a primitive kind. And I could see the connection, but this kind of cost-cutting attack on bureaucracy and red tape that maybe doesn't really understand too much about how the government actually works. This just sounded so much like Ross Perot to me. And he even cited Ross Perot, Musk even cited Ross Perot as an inspiration, I think once on the Rogan show. And also the other thing is, and this is not many people know this, so I was just fascinated by this, is that what how Ross Perot envisioned the country being governed was what he called electronic town halls. And it was going to be these kind of online plebiscites about what people wanted in the government. And it would be kind of a rolling all day online vote, just an electronic plebiscite. And people obviously pointed out, like this is subject to manipulation. Big billionaires could do things with these platforms, but he basically, no one at the time fully understood it, but he was basically talking about social media, which I thought was really, really, in retrospect, quite striking. So
But you were
yeah,
hoping that the book would be less relevant, or it would be more like a historical
well,
critic.
it's nice to have written something that people find illuminating.
Yeah.
I would have been perfectly happy for the book to have been appreciated by a small audience
As a
of
curiosity.
hobbyists. Yeah, but
A
no,
curiosity.
I mean, yeah, it's wonderful that people find it interesting. But yeah, I I was surprised, and then I thought that the Trump administration might take a different angle, a different appearance.
Yeah.
So I thought some of the things I wrote about the paleo conservatives and their attitudes towards both immigration and foreign policy and all these things might look a lot different. But frankly, it really looks a lot of the time,
Very.
with some exceptions we can talk about, like Pat Buchanan on the internet.
Yeah.
So
And I really
yeah,
appreciate it because there are so many. I mean, there's an entire
yeah,
cottage industry of these political science books that are extremely monocausal. And they will try
yeah,
to sell to you that it's social media, it's microplastics, it's because women are from Venus, like all sorts of reasons why everything is falling
yeah,
apart. And instead, you kind of like, I think this is maybe one of the only books that I read at
yeah,
this scope that says that's not the right framing. Like, we literally need a different paradigm of how to understand this problem. You actually have to go back in time and
yeah.
see where this was was born. And it's really interesting because, you know, we just had Fukuyama on Interintellect, and obviously, like, his entire scholarship rests on
Yeah.
the premise that the Cold War kind of morally held together something that had an external enemy. And the moment
Hmm.
that disappears, the enemy becomes one among us, and all this like
Yeah.
fragmentation happens. But I feel like there has to be something else. As I was reading the book now, I was kind of reminiscing of being a 12-year-old, mid-90s aspiring blog film critic that I was. I didn't have many friends, and watching the Milos Forman movie, People versus Larry Flint. And at the time in Hungary, we didn't have I mean, one of the characters in the story obviously is Jerry Falwell. And in
Yeah.
Hungary at the time, we didn't have these kinds of people. Also, like Hungary
Right.
is ex-communist, it's a Catholic country, so the clergy doesn't really have wives, so you don't have this like
Yeah.
both pater familias and clergyman character, preacher character that America has. But it was
Yeah.
interesting to me even then, as a little nerd I was, that why does this come out in the mid 90s?
Mm.
Like, and from
Yeah.
the director who would always, I mean, Milos Forman, who did Hair and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and obviously as an immigrant into America, always is very sensitive to what's going on. So there was a sensibility that something has to be done with this growing nostalgia peddling, as you say, the Republicans being attacked from the right, which is kind of
Yeah.
a weird image. But there's this creature there that is born in the 90s, and artists are
Yeah.
sensitive to it, right? That there is this new
Well,
archetype on the scene.
yeah, I mean there are some movies that reflect it like Falling Down, but I want to talk a little bit about Fukuyama because the book's title When the Clock Broke is obviously a little bit of a play on the end of history. It's kind of my alternate version of the end of history. I mean, to Fukuyama's credit, what he says in that book is a lot less naive than people say it was. So he talks a lot about how one possibility of what the end of history looks like might be, the return of ethnic nationalism. Where I really disagree with Fukuyama is, Fukuyama views this as a kind of um, it's something, or its origin is in the soul. It's a problem of recognition. It's a problem of what human meaning is in this post-historical society. About this timotic self that can't find an outlet. And I just am much more of a materialist. I look at what was going on in the way the United States was economically set up, and this is the clock that broke. Um, and the clock that broke is that, there is a certain regime of accumulation and production that worked from about, 1945 until 1975. And then everything, oh, that's fascinating. And I wish I knew that. And that's a huge oversight on my part. So, and this really begins to break. You see the first places this begins to break down in the early 1990s.
But
So
there's
I
this
think,
lag here, right? Because it breaks down in
yeah,
the 70s, but only really comes to its first kind of combustion moment in the early 90s. And then we still have, we're just like laughing at the Zoom chat. We still have until 2015, basically. So there is almost like these like 15 to 25-year lags that
yeah.
happen where
Yeah.
they're
Well,
forced to
but
hold back.
what my story is basically is that the productivity boost and the dot-com boom and the success the kind of superficial success of finance and Wall Street kind of being let loose papers over a lot of these problems, which then come roaring back with the collapse of the financial bubble. So yeah, I mean, I just think that these things kind of went subterranean and then were exploded back onto the scene.
Hmm.
Um,
Can I ask you also
it,
a little bit about the
yeah, sure.
psychology before we move on? Because there's like this, I mean,
Yeah,
the book is of course full of incredibly beautiful paragraphs and also some
thank
very
you.
funny ones. But there's one that I particularly just kind of like noted out. You say autonomy might be the desire, but enemy and atomization were the fear. The
Yeah,
nation was undergoing, here you're talking about the early 90s, an epidemic of loneliness.
yeah,
Loneliness is one of the unshaped political problems of our times. It is the curse of American life. And I'm bringing this up because
Yeah.
I find that in your book, one of the central themes is trust. And the most
Hmm.
important element of the polycrisis, at least to me,
Mm.
would love to hear from other attendees here, were
Yeah.
definitely the breakdown of trust in the elder, the expert, the person who looks after me so myself and my children can sleep soundly, but also the kind of negative solidarity that you talk about. When
Yeah.
I can't trust somebody, at least I will know who I don't trust, and I can kind of band together with people that I don't like, which to me really is like
Right.
the clock is broken, but the kind of Tocquevillian ideal of interest-based, value-based association, it becomes
Yeah.
kind of anti-association, which is a completely different
Mm.
political philosophy, if not
Yeah.
more than vibe. It's a philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, okay, well, I included the stuff about the loneliness crisis with a little bit of with some with some degree of ambivalence because I took it seriously and I thought it was striking that it was similar themes were brought up, but I also wondered what it meant when you see these things as a historian, when you see something that people bring up as the pressing crisis of the present, and then you look back 30 years and there was already the same discourse. You kind of wonder what is really going on? Is this a misplaced? Is this a fad, a hysteria, a moral panic? Or is this, the same problem going on? So when I wrote those paragraphs, it was with a certain level of ambiguity and uncertainty of what was actually going on. What do I think about the loneliness crisis? I
Yeah,
mean,
because you don't see it as monocausal, right? So you
yeah,
use these like themes and kind of the
yeah.
different
I mean, I think that what the people I talked about, they had a lot of the similar observations, which was technology was a big part of it. It was abstracting people from each other. The changes in work, the changes in employment were and gender relations. Um, and again, these are material. Speaking as something of a historical materialist, these are material conditions. You've got the forces of production, the technology. You've got the relations of production, the jobs, and you've got the relations of reproduction, which is gender relations.
the divorce revolution part
Revolution.
is
Yeah.
brilliant in the book. I
And
don't
you
know if
have
you guys remember
so
this.
you have a changing historical conjuncture or really structural more than that, what's going on in the background. And this changes people's relations to each other in profound ways. Men and women don't need life partners in the same way, or they can't support them. So the whole institution goes on through a crisis.
Hmm.
What do men and women need and want for each other? What are men and women? I mean, that's become more of a question
Yeah.
today, but it was beginning. It's really interesting, and this was pointed out to me by a critic, and I thought was really interesting. They thought my chapter on daytime TV shows was a little snobby because I was like, look at the degeneration of discourse in the United States, and I stand by that to a certain degree. I think there was something
You're
to
an
it.
inter-intellect. This is a safe space for
Right, right.
criticizing pop culture.
Well, it's kind of daytime. It's a talk show in its own way. So, but then what people point out is these shows actually introduce things that later, maybe in an exploitative way at first, but in ways that made people perhaps more tolerant or understanding. I mean, the first time most people saw or thought about a transgendered person might have been on the Jerry Springer show. And the way it was presented was not necessarily it was in an exploitative or a trashy way, but it was also it was opening people up to do ideas and experiences. So I and
Also like what to
often
expect from life. Like what I remember
yeah,
most about like my own like early teens. And I'm a millennial. I'm definitely child of divorce. Everybody around me was
right,
child of divorce. Like our like expectation or visualization of a human lifetime suddenly looked very different from even Gen Z
right,
people when they were growing up. Like for my
yeah,
generation, it's completely, I don't know about other people here in the room, but like as a millennial, for me, it has never been like a guarantee that if you get married, you stay married.
yeah,
It becomes this
which
kind
is
of
interesting because that's
treacherous
having a yeah.
waters. The same as
That's having,
employment, right? Like there was a
yeah,
generation
yeah,
where if daddy got a job after university,
yeah.
then he would stay in that, mostly would stay in that career, maybe even at
Cradle to
the
the grave.
company, and that just
Yeah,
goes out the window. And not just in America,
sure.
that was like the 20th century condition, the post-war
Yeah.
condition of stability for better or worse.
Well, I mean, in a certain way, if you want to go down the Kojev Fukuyama
Yeah.
angle, there wasn't that, communism and what the kind of social democratic West, they were sort of the same system, like you had all these big giant stable institutions where you could kind of be employed your whole life and you had a kind of a reliable world. You know,
And people sought novelty in different ways because people always need, like, it's more like an innate need, how much freedom and
yeah,
novelty a person needs. So if you spend your entire life at the same company, then you found
yeah,
credible enjoyments in other ways.
yeah.
But
I
the
think
structure was
Kojev,
very different.
yeah, Kojev, who was, Fukuyama's master. I don't know if he actually studied it, but it was who he took most of his inspiration from. He thought that the realization of communism was 1950s America. That was the country that had realized, this post-ideological and material abundance, which is really funny.
Even
But yeah,
earlier, like as a European, for me, I always say that America is way more on the left than Europe, even though the
yeah,
practices are different. Because here you can just go anywhere in America, start a community, and people will be like, sure, we will move there with our kids and like we will all
right,
participate. You would never be able to do this in Europe. Like it's so
right.
established and there's a church and everything would never
Yeah,
like
yeah.
that kind of like DIY culture is
Yeah, and I think you see that's a
collectivism.
reason. I mean, that's the reason why it's so easy for this fragmentation to happen in the United States, because as you were saying, there's this Tocquevillian side of things where people just kind of associate the way they want to. But then there's a dark side of it, or a complicated side of it, where you have the breakdown of older institutions, and then not necessarily something that's so great to replace it. And you have people kind of adrift and not becoming integrated into larger wholes where they find them to be offer them good opportunities both materially and also just to have a satisfying and meaningful life. Now, I think it's underrated. That's a little bit of, I think every human being, I think if you look at the 1950s and you look at the literature of the 1950s, I mean, people are being weighed down by what they feel is a terrible conformism, and they're unhappy in their own ways. So, I mean, I don't think that there's a formula for society that gets rid of these existential problems, but they change. Back then, and this lasts up into the 90s, you have everyone thinking that the office, like in Office Space or stuff like that, in these 90s
Organization.
bureaucracy, or even in Fight Club, is like the biggest nightmare for humanity. And then people kind of now looking at yeah, you know people are now looking back to those things with nostalgia and being like, oh, there were these companies were pretty good and those jobs were pretty good, and now people are more adrift. So, you know, that's just the way historical memory works to a certain extent. But yeah, I
But
mean,
that contributes
yeah,
to the negative
yeah, these are all,
association or negative. You
yeah,
see negative solidarity, right? In the
yeah,
book. So what
yeah.
is
I mean, negative solidarity is a concept I got from Hannah Arendt. Like she talks about that as being, she talks about the kind of fragmentation of European society and then the reorganization around what she calls negative solidarity, which is basically not liking certain people or having certain fears or hatreds and being organized around that. Um, and that was the organizing principle of, the types of right-wing populists that I describe in the book, and their intellectuals. Which, as somebody mentioned in the chat, are, yes, the paleocons who I talk about at length. But if you want to reorganize American society against expelling or attacking an internal enemy, and think of, there's a real America there's a middle America which has been put down by East Coast elites, and exactly what that means is subject to interpretation. Um, so and they have to kind of have this national revolution against this cosmopolitan elite, these globalists, and reimpose the rule of real Americans, quote unquote. And I think insofar as this has what we're seeing now has any kind of ideological coherence, that's the story they're telling themselves. Obviously, when you look at it, it's a big kleptocratic mess. Um, but insofar as it has any kind of coherence or you can make some kind of myth about it, it's that. It's an overthrow of a what a was viewed as a kind of self-interested elite that didn't care about the nation, that cared about the world. It's and cosmopolitanism.
Mm.
So, I think that I know that it's controversial. I want to get people's thoughts because I see some really interesting stuff in the chat already, but I know it's controversial also just to say, well, there's any kind of intellectual history to all this stuff because it's really happens a lot on a very sub-intellectual level. But I do believe, I can't help but thinking that the people I write about sort of had the theory of and we're seeing the practice now. I mean, it's hard to get away from it for me. I mean, there are differences. It's not exactly how they turned out, but this is what they were hoping for. A big populist presidency that would use the power of the state to attack enemies, that would get us away from international agreements and have a much more self-interested foreign policy, that would pursue protectionism, that would be very restrictionist about immigration, that would protect certain domestic industries, especially ones that were kind of ideologically and politically on side. It's all there.
They won.
It's all there. So yeah. Anyway, I'm just sort of making the case for my book
Yeah.
there. But yeah, I mean,
But your book is more about the losers who couldn't win yet because the times
yeah, it
were
was the
not
sort of
ripe
the
enough.
conditions weren't right. The
Yeah.
conditions weren't because I think that the
Yeah.
contradictions that appeared to the little cracks that appeared were just not wide enough. Yeah. And it
But
took a much bigger crisis and a much bigger,
information
yeah,
ecosystem as well. But it's so interesting,
yeah,
and my takeaway as a kind of hobby historian in my life has always
yeah,
been that whenever you confront something in history that is just so overwhelming and complete, and you don't understand where it's coming from, it's because it's not the first time,
yeah,
right? Like even
yeah,
the biggest unprecedented times that we talk about have, when you see human will achieving something so disorganizing and so well organized itself, it's always because there is a precedent and there is a learning curve. It's just not necessarily visible to the naked eye. I want to just ask one more
yeah,
question, and which is
sure.
about an unpopular front at exploration, and then
Yeah,
please feel free to raise your hands with the hand raise
sure.
in the Zoom, which you will find under React. And I'm also going to go through the Zoom chat and see if
Okay.
there's anything there. I want to ask about the real, because you mentioned now, the matters of reality and the what we probably jokingly would call kayfabe or LARPing on the internet.
Yeah,
So you talk in one of the Unpopular Front essays about how you had to basically like sit on the internet and observe how certain jokes and memes and hysterias become totally internalized by people. And
right.
then from then on, they are the real. What is
Yeah.
what is this and what do you think
Well,
the psychology of this might be?
Well, I just think that that's, partially that's very easy with the internet, and you can kind of ironically back yourself into all kinds of weird beliefs. But I think that, this is just the nature of human action belief is that there's a certain level of pretense to everything until it's real, like most successful people are a little delusional when because they believe in a reality that hasn't quite come to be. Uh, So there's a certain amount of pretense involved in all human action or belief about the future or belief about the self that's not quite real. And there's a lot of playing pretend that's incumbent into successful activity. And there's a lot of imagination. And when things are mostly in the imagination or playing, people can also take them less seriously. And I just think that irony, if you want to call it that, is just a part of the human condition, a part of how we play social roles, and we kind of put our toes into social roles. You joke around, and then maybe you realize you weren't joking so much after all. I think that's the way people get into a lot of stuff. Um, so yeah, I just think that obviously the internet makes it extremely visible, and accelerates it. But I think there's a certain amount of irony, pretense, imagination. I mean, these are just structural parts of the way human beings are and behave. And they not everyone begins it and everything in dead earnest. I'm trying to give an example. I mean, it's just like when you have a kid who has an interest in something. Let's say they play the piano, or they kind of see what it look like a concert pianist looks like from TV or movies or whatever, and they play act it, and they're just playing. No, I didn't. Unfortunately, she died. Oh, sorry. That's not the question. Wasn't for me. So, uh, and then they become it. I mean, if they're serious about it, they start to become it. So I just think that that's just part of, in a way, if we could speak kind of ahistorically about human action, is that those elements are always going to be there. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And so,
yeah.
but I wonder whether that means that we need to be a little bit more careful around the jokes. That would be a very woke point to make,
I
that
think that there's something to,
answer.
well, I mean, look, I think that there's a little bit of both. I think you got it. This is where judgment comes in, and this is
Yeah.
what makes this so very difficult is, you know, with joking and irony, which I'm a big fan of, and I don't like to be uptight, but you can tell, I believe, if you're being responsible, you can tell. Look, when this is an example I always use. When someone tells a joke that's in poor taste, and they're doing it because they know it's going to break the ice and be kind of fun because it's a shock, and you're like, okay, that was funny, and then, but then if that person continues, then there's jokes. I think Freud, when he talks about jokes, talks about when they become tendentious. So when someone continually makes certain people the butt of their jokes, or they continually do it, you're like, I don't think that you're just trying to play with the norms. I think you got an issue, and you're using this as a way to express aggression. There's always a little bit of aggression in jokes, but then there's playful aggression. And then there's aggression that you feel is more tendentious, is more harmful. So I think it's not that hard. I mean, everyone has different sensitivities for these things and different ideas of when it becomes harmful and when it does. But I think everybody knows roughly when you're listening to somebody, when you're like, I don't think you're really joking. I think that you're pretending, you're testing something out, and you're actually quite uh your views about this are quite bigoted, and you're seeing how it goes over with other people. And that's different from making fun of oneself for having backwards views, or making fun of the existence of backward views,
Yeah.
and just playing around with those things, which I think is fine and healthy.
Mm.
So it's really sad that the choices are between, and I understand, wokeness or whatever you want to call it, or I understand. My interpretation was like, I understood why people got uptight after Trump won, because it looked like these norms were being, you can see it now every single day. I mean, look at the filth he did today. It was horrible. You see every day these kind of norms of behavior getting dissolved. It's, of ways we talk about each other, of ways we talk about minorities, women, et cetera, et cetera. And so I understand the impulse when this seems to be starting
Yeah.
to get dissolved, for people to get a little uptight about it and say, let's keep these norms in place, or let's reinforce some certain norms. Now, was that
You're talking
counterproductive?
about a group that was, I think, disillusioned with the elite with whom we associated. Like some behaviors became just associated with the elite and no longer with the people in the Tocquevillian sense. And so with the elites go, I mean, we've seen this like French Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Russian Revolution, that all the habits, all the customs, the art.
You see, I don't agree with that. You see,
Okay.
because I think that I don't think that um I think that wokeness was just as populist as anti-wokeness or vice signaling, as someone called it,
Yeah,
because
anybody who is disappointed in the elite will
right,
want to
attack
seek
them.
to
Yeah.
save the norms, right?
Yeah. It was an attack. It was an attack. It was also an attack on, in many cases, on elites. It was canceling people who are mostly socially prominent people. So, often from people who were socially subordinate for them, who felt they had been insulted, injured, preyed upon, so on and so forth. So I never believed it. The way the class politics, this whole thing gets presented, I don't think that's what you're saying, is that oh well, wokeness is for the elites, and the other stuff, the joking, the irony is for the populist uprising. It's not that simple. These things cut across. And it wasn't, I'm sure most elites in media, academia, and stuff like that would prefer not to have seen. Look at the Jeffrey Epstein emails. I'm sure all these guys would have much rather this big cultural revolutions not happen, because it upset their nice little thing that they had going on. So, yeah, I think that stuff is populist too, and it is unsettling for elites. And part of the reaction to it, I think, is elites trying to protect themselves and saying, make common cause with people who are like, don't you hate this stuff too? But they have an interest in not. Larry Summers, I'm sorry, his his complaints about wokeness were not uh disinterested. They were particularly plugged into the way he lived his life and who he associated with, and how he conducted himself, and he would prefer that the norms with those things didn't get tighter. Anyway, that's a little bit off topic, but that's just
Yeah,
my
no, I hear you.
thoughts about that subject.
Any questions in the audience? I saw, yeah, David, and then I saw also Todd Pierce, Jess sharing some very, very interesting points in the chat.
Yeah,
If you want to jump in, I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't raise your hand, but I think we would like love to hear from you guys as well. David.
yeah.
Great. Good to see you, Anna. John, thanks for joining us.
Sure.
Love your book, love your Substack. Let's talk about Vance.
Oh yeah.
I I have an email saved in my inbox of a Substack piece you wrote August 2024
Uh-huh.
titled "These People Are Nazis." And it's centered around, for those who didn't read it, it's centered around Vance's forward to the book Unhumans, I think it was called, by Jack
Yeah.
Poposiak.
Yeah.
Um, and I was like, I want to save this and come back to this in a couple of years and see how well the predictions go. So I'm curious to hear
Yeah.
how you see Vance fitting into the constellation of the new right and this sort
Yeah.
of welter of ideas you track in the book in the early
Hmm.
90s, how they've come to fruition now. Where do you see him taking that? Do you see him as a viable uh, successor
Yeah.
electorally, culturally for the MAGA movement?
And can I
Well, I
add two
was,
things to this because I think this is super important, David. One is that he's Catholic, right? He's a convert, and I think that's very, very important and not super common in American culture, unlike in many places in Europe. So I would just definitely want to add to that. And the fact that this book, your book, John, is dedicated to a relative of yours who perished in the
yeah.
Holocaust, which I think is
Yeah.
probably not an accident.
No, it's not. Okay, so I think Vance is occupying a very tenuous position in the coalition and what he's trying to do at this point. As we can see, there are a lot of divisions right now. There is a division within MAGA, within the kind of far right of the Republican Party, that's a dominant faction. You have what you would call, this anti-Semitic faction, which is the America First side. And obviously Vance views part of his political future is associated with them because he refuses to criticize them under any circumstances, and he kind of constantly poo-poos that it's a real issue and so on and so forth. Doesn't really criticize Fuentes by name. I don't think he's done it once. So he clearly views those people as, and even though they're vicious with him, especially because his wife is not white, and they attack him. But that's part of their political strategy, is to kind of twist people's arms by attacking them this way. But then he has a relationship. So he has this populist, nationalist, America First side of his ideology. I think he's very captured by the intellectuals, if you want to call them that, of that side of the movement. He's close with them, and he speaks their language, and he articulates their language. But he's also close to Silicon Valley, which that side, that populist wing of MAGA, now views as the enemy, as a globalist enemy, globalist in all its senses. And he complains about Palantir, as does Steve Bannon. I mean, I'm sorry, Nick Fuentes complains about Palantir, as does Steve Bannon. So this kind of what I call the kind of brown shirty wing of MAGA, the kind of populists and national socialists, if you want to even put it that way, are very hostile to the tech elites. And I think that what Vance has in mind is, I got to keep this coalition together. These guys have the money and the certain amount of power, but these guys are going to be my future voters in a Republican primary. Also, they're going to be harassing my people all the time. They're going to be, creating all these social media mobs and creating all these problems. So he's trying to do this math formula to keep all these people together, which is a very tough thing to do. Now, it's not popular. It's not impossible, because Trump does it, but Trump does it by being incoherent. That's a gift. Basically, that's a gift because he can be all things to all people. And Vance, with his intellectual, I mean, he's also full of shit and lies all the time, but not exactly the same way. I mean, Trump gets a lot of mileage out of seeming out to lunch. So people go, oh, he's just kind of in his own world. Vance would have to make more of an account of himself to all these different constituencies, saying, well, how are you working with these people, because we don't like those people? I don't know. I mean, like, I could see him winning a primary. I don't have as low opinion of his political skills as some of my fellow liberal and left-wing commentators who've just find him to be so unappealing as a person. But the fact of the matter is that he did a very good, I mean, maybe the competition wasn't up to snuff, but he turned around a very negative image in that debate with Tim Walz, where people went into that thinking that he was not, and he debated in a very tough way, and people thought, this guy, I mean, he was dishonest, but that's not a vice in politics, and people came away from it thinking this is a smart guy. So I think he's a little more slick than people say. I don't know if he can pull off this trick of keeping the Groypers and the Palantir Teal people together, but it's possible, and that's not good. That would be bad. I mean, I'm hoping that these contradictions split it apart, but that's not, the way they may broker some kind of deal with each other. I mean, Fuentes already has the ability to really discipline his own people. Yeah, that's true. And Palantir also kind of just wants to become integrated with the state in a certain way. Nick Fuentes has the power to tell his people you're stupid, and they listen to him. So he could, if someone approaches him and says, he's a real leader of that group of people. If someone approaches him and says, look, you're going to get certain things you want, but I need you to hold back your thugs. It's something he can deliver on. It's not like other people can kind of say that, but then the people bolt and find a more radical leader. I think that Fuentes actually has a real power over his followers. So yes, there is something to that comment. So Yeah, I don't know. I think that he's obviously trying to position himself for what's next, and the trick that he has to pull off looks a little difficult, but I don't think it's impossible.
Mm.
Yeah,
Lots of follows, but thanks. I'll let
sure,
somebody else get in.
sure.
DJ?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was next. This is great. I
Oh,
feel like I
thank
could
you.
talk to you for hours about this. I grew up in the South. My mom was a party official. She campaigned for Newt Gingrich
Mm.
in 1974.
Oh,
People,
wow.
he ran 3 times before he got elected.
Right, right, right.
So I saw all this stuff like up close, as a kid. Um, but but I'm curious. I want to contrast your book, and I don't know if
Yeah,
you've read it, but have you read The 90s by Chuck Klosterman?
I have, yeah.
And like your book was it was PTSD to me. I was like, oh, I remember every single one of these things. I mean,
Yeah,
my first vote for president was in 1988, and
right.
I lived through all of that.
Yeah,
But Klosterman's book was like a nice warm blanket. Like,
yeah,
oh, wasn't it fun? These TV shows I've forgotten about in the 90s. And I'm just wondering
yeah.
if you thought at all through some of the things he said when you were writing this.
I didn't read, I intentionally didn't read Chuck Klosterman's book until I was done with the book because I was worried that it was going to influence me or I was going to be upset that they got to some point that I made. So I avoided, and I also avoided, which came out as I was finishing my book, and I wish I hadn't, the Lichtenstein and Stein book about Clinton, a fabulous failure. I really should have read that because it would have made my book a lot stronger. The Klosterman book is doing something very different, and I think more about the latter half of the decade. So I think that he comes from a person, I had the advantage as a historian of not, I mean, I remembered some of the things, but memory is not always a good thing for a historian because cultural memory becomes consensus. And what
Mhm.
historians often do is say, well, the memory of this period is not quite right, and it needs to be revised. Now, I think some of the observations he makes about culture, about the aimlessness in that era, but also the things that were kind of nice and reassuring and hopeful about I ran true to me because I remember more of the things he was talking about. And I thought so I think some of the book was really strong to me. I think it's just a different kind of book, and he wasn't advancing a really strong thesis about what the causes of this stuff were. But I think it would be very hard. I was considering writing a sequel to this book, but it would be, I think, harder to write a book, a successful book about the second half of the decade because it is so different from our own time. And I saw all these parallels when I was starting to write the book. And when I look at the latter half of the decade, it's a time of such optimism and success. You have an almost utopianism that comes with the first wave of the internet, with kind of the ecological, revolution that people thought was going to happen. So yeah, I thought his book was really interesting. Um, it was something I was thinking about when I was thinking about doing a sequel, which I don't think I'm going to do now. But yeah, we were kind of talking about two different things. And the other thing is, he touches on it very obliquely. And this is not a criticism. I think he's writing it from a certain angle of um, people in the media who are aware of culture. And he writes about this. He's self-conscious about, like, actually, was Gen X really like this, or was this just a fraction that we saw in movies and culture? Was the things that were going on in culture? He's aware of it, but I do think, like, the people I write about who were Ross Perot fanatics were not particularly cool. They weren't like Gen X cool people, and or the people who were, and I think that's something I got from Rick Perlstein's great books, where he says, "Look, man, the '60s, we have this image of the '60s of all being all about the the hippies," and he's like, young people in the '60s, most of them voted for Nixon. So he revised that picture. There's another America. You get the America of we get through pop cultural memory, and then there's an America that's as Pat Buchanan once called them, the forgotten, the silent majority of forgotten Americans. So, yeah, I think Klosterman was talking about things from the point of view of pop culture, from the point of the media, and when you're talking about politics, in a certain way, I mean, maybe you delve a little deeper into the country, I think, and you get where people who don't get represented necessarily in pop culture, where they seek representation and they seek recognition. So, yeah.
Thank you. And by the way, the Zoom for this this salon is like chef's kiss. Todd?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, I was very impressed with John's book.
Oh, thank
and
you.
and your articles. I just posted a link in there to one of your articles from 2022, Thiel, Schmidt, and Spengler, an addendum.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're one of the very few people who noted the conservative revolutionaries, which
Yeah.
I would argue were a rival fascist group to the Nazis in the 1920s,
Yeah.
with Carl Schmitt and some others, and they migrated in the Nazi Party because the
Yeah.
Nazis won. But
Right.
they were
Absolutely.
they were fascists as well.
Yeah.
Maybe not
Absolutely.
quite so anti-Semitic, but as hateful as most other people, as were the Nazis, including the Slavs, meaning the
Yeah.
Russians. But anyway, I find this so overlooked, looking at the political theory origins of what's going on today versus
Yeah.
the material view of things. I mean, it'd be like in 1928 to 1932, looking at Weimar and these things going on in Weimar and paying no attention to Mein Kampf and the ideas within it.
Yeah.
Which is just as crazy today as just looking at these material conditions that we can identify, but ignoring these ideas that were embedded in these people who are now calling themselves paleocons,
Yeah.
as presenting themselves in opposition to the neocons as people became war weary. But in fact, the paleocons and people names, I've got books and stuff all online,
Yeah.
but I'll look them up. These
Sam
people are
Francis. Yeah.
fanatically right wing and
Yeah.
warmongering as the neocons ever could have become.
Right.
I mean, I'm thinking Bill Buckley and Wilmore Kendall's guy, everybody should be
Yeah.
studying, because he was the original fascist
Fascinating
thinker
guy. Yeah.
post-World War II America.
Yeah.
And
Fascinating.
what he sold was majoritarian democracy. And there's a project going on now by the American Conservative magazine, oftentimes by the Quincy Institute, to whitewash these people as, well, they were the realists and they wanted to avoid war, when in
Right.
fact they wanted to nuke virtually
Yeah.
half the world,
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
And so there's this cognitive campaign, as it's called now. I used to be in psyops too, amongst
Uh-huh.
a very non-traditional career, and know quite a bit. But cognitive war takes that to an entirely higher level. But
Right.
when we get to Thiel, and one gripe I got, and I'm withdrawing from a lot of stuff because it's, number one, dangerous, as we can see with Senator Kelly being possibly charged with sedition as a retired Army officer or whatever, Navy officer. But the point being is, no, we're into something that is far different than ever preceded it in the United States. And we need to look at the ideas to realize how dangerous this is. And my frustration, I'll go to end this pretty quick, but I see peace activists, which I consider myself one for quite a while, but no longer, as I see them citing to Tucker Carlson, Mike Benz, and all these other national conservatives. And the fact that they come right out in the open, Tucker Carlson, Frontes, but Carlson was first, along with what's his name, Cooper, proclaiming that the Nazis were the peacekeepers of the 1920s and 30s. So we've really gotten into some strange territory, but you look who's the money behind it, and you got Peter Thiel, Charles Cook, and I could go on with a few more of these. So I put some.
Okay. But there's a lot of left money as well. So if we're like looking at funders, let's be a little bit balanced here politically, because there's
putting aside the money issue, but the ideas themselves. I mean, there's a whole lot of things that Democrats need to be condemned for, and they basically brought a whole lot of this on themselves. And the Goldwater Democrats, I've been in most of the last, the presidents of this late part of the century, last century, libraries. Goldwater was very influential on the Democrats through Scoop Jackson. So when you look at Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, you can say, well, really, they're Goldwater Democrats, because the ideas that they imbibed were right out of Goldwaterism. My stepmother, was a Goldwaterite, so I saw firsthand in the 1964 election how radical the right was. I'll stop there to let other people talk.
Well, I mean,
My point
in
is simply
terms
we
of,
got to
I mean,
get
this whole
serious about.
culture, right? Of like, you don't want a world necessarily that is like Reid Hoffman versus Peter Thiel and everything else is kind of downstream from these billions of dollars because that's not really democratic.
no,
Well, forget the
no,
dollars. It's the ideas. It's the ideas behind it. I mean, Hitler won that conservative revolution with ideas. Heritage Foundation has a plan. You read Project 2025. We're seeing it. It's being carried out right now. And the libertarians behind it, like Charles Cook, we see that with Doge. We're ripping the country apart and ripping anything out of the hands of anybody other than the plutocrats. And boy, how much more evident does that have to be than right now?
yeah, I mean, look, in terms of that piece that you cited about Teal Schmidt and Spengler, I mean, like my belief, I don't know if you're aware of it, but about a very interesting book about conservative revolution and the Third Reich is a great book who I just spoke to the author of, Reactionary Modernism by Jeffrey Herf.
I read it
Uh,
long ago.
Yeah, and he's a terrific writer, and that's a terrific piece of history. And I think that basically Peter Thiel is a reactionary modernist, very self-consciously in that tradition, which combines, a belief in technology and technological advances with the authoritarian and regressive social order. And when you're talking about ideas, like it's really interesting. Sam Francis, who's one of the paleocons I talk about in the book, who I think is sort of the theorist of Trumpism
Right.
before it existed. In his book that was only posthumously published, um, he actually cites Jeffrey Herf's book Reactionary Modernism kind of favorably as this is what we're into.
Right.
This is the kind of regime that we're looking to create, which I have to actually tell Jeffrey about that. So I told him about it, but I got to show him the citation. Yeah, so no, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, the thing that I wanted to accomplish in my book was a balance, and this is as a historian, I'm obviously really interested in culture. I'm really interested in ideology and ideas, and I think those are essential to understand things. And I think that the real trick of being a historian is to put those things in a social context and see how those things are all shaping each other. So yeah, I mean, I begin the book with the conditions that the United States is in, but the protagonist of my book, if you want to call it that, or the chorus of the book, are very much the intellectuals, the ideologues, and the propagandists who spread these ideas. So it's always a matter, and I also in my own thinking and work just go back and forth of what's more important. When I began my project, my first interest was in Murray Rothbard because he wrote that great, well, that very eerily accurate piece called Right Wing Populism in the wake of David Duke's defeat in 1992 and the gubernatorial race in Louisiana, which I just thought was like the text of Trumpism and launched the whole thing. And I was hyper fixated on this group of intellectuals, the paleocons. And then I realized when I wanted to expand this into a book, these guys lived in a whole social and political context that was recognizable to me. And they were responding to it and exploiting the tensions in it and saying, here's why our ideas will succeed under these conditions. So it's really a matter of balancing both those things. And it's kind of what's difficult, but also fun about being a historian. I I don't like, I often, when things are so pure history of ideas or intellectual history, I'm like, you're missing the social stuff, and when things are too about society or too about the economy, I'm saying you're missing the cultural stuff. And I think the best histories and the ones I really admire manage to bring those things into conversation with each other. So that's what I was trying to go for. I would say at the end of the day, they're different manifestations of the same thing and under different lights. And you can't understand the one without the other. So yeah.
Let me just throw in quick. I agree with you,
Sure.
which I already said. I really respected your book.
Oh, thanks so much.
I only bring up this other only because this is going on, And this discussion seemed to be not getting into that. So no, the cultural is the sort of call it the leading edge of the ideological. I mean, maybe the following edge, whatever, however you want to describe. One point, final point about Francis. Francis was a disciple of Wilmore Kendall.
Yeah, and Wilmore Kendall and Burnham. Yep.
And you read Wilmore Kendall, and again, believe me, that is right out of Carl Schmitt. Majoritarian democracy is all about evicting from the society all those people who won't vote your way. I mean,
well, funnily enough, Murray Rothbard once called it the philosophy of a lynch mob.
Yeah.
The friends and the enemy.
Rothbard has his faults too, but
yeah, of course,
everybody should
of course.
read. Everybody should read Carl Schmitt to understand the current moment, so to speak. I think that's
absolutely.
Jess, thank you so much for your patience. I love the Christmas decorations.
Hi, sorry I haven't had my video on, but my internet is being funky. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
I have to admit, I've not read your book yet, but
that's okay.
I'm enjoying the conversation. I will probably read it. I am curious in the research for your book or any of the study that you may have done, or I might have missed it in one of your Substacks, if you did any research on how this has also been sort of built up by the history of political action committees and super PACs, especially like Paul Manafort and Roger Stone. I can't remember the name of their lobbying firm, but then like how that started in the 80s and 90s and then led up to like Citizens United by SCOTUS in 2010. So I'm curious to hear about that.
You know, I gotta tell you, that's a little bit of a blind spot for me. I mean, the story of money in politics and PACs and that stuff. I mean, the campaign finance stuff gets really bad later, obviously, because Citizens United, but it's already an issue. And the book does talk about the degree to which the conservative movement is kind of funded by these philanthropic trusts, right? And that money's behind it. And you know, there is a degree to which I also talk about the different industrial interests which are backing the different factions of the Republican Party. So, you know, Buchanan obviously is not the mainstream candidate. He doesn't have the Chamber of Commerce behind him. But he's got industries in the South, like textile industry, Roger Milliken, great, you know, textile magnate who funded the conservative movement out of his own pockets. And in the middle of the 1980s, gets upset that they've turned the Heritage Foundation is so free trade and Reagan is so free trade. And he says, look, we got to protect American industry. And he brings this case to Pat Buchanan. And Pat Buchanan, you know, his campaign and gets funded essentially by Roger Milliken. So, you know, a lot of people say when they look at Trumpism and they say, where is all these economic ideas coming from? It's this whole crackpot. That's true. But there are industrial interests in the United States, as we've seen, that want protectionism. And there is some kind of section of American capital that's into this kind of stuff. It's not like, I mean, it may not be finance, it may not be retail or things that are very, you know, rely on cheap imports. But, you know, there is a material basis both on the labor side of workers who feel like immigration is getting to them and you know, they want protectionism because industry abroad is affecting them. But you also see it on the capital side where their industries are saying, you know, we can't compete with Germany, we can't compete with Japan, or now China, and are interested in protectionism. So I see the book does talk a little bit about the money in politics in that way, but like in terms of the world of the sleazy political consultant, to a certain extent, at least in their own self-conception, the populist revolts I'm talking about were meant to be rejections of those consultants, which they associate with the mainstream of the Republican Party. Now that changes. Roger Stone, obviously a very mercurial figure. He gets very close to Trump, and now he's Mr. Right-wing populism. But he did some weird stuff where he may have been using Trump to rat fuck Buchanan. There's all kinds of weird imaginations with what he was up to. Um,
Well, I bring it
it's
up because
yeah,
normally I am, and Anna knows, I'm definitely on the side of like, let's call out the right. But I do
yeah.
think that there is sort of like, spiraling effect of both sides, the left and the right, using PACs and super PACs. And
Oh yeah,
the concept of a political action campaign actually came from the unions in like
yeah,
the early 1900s. And
yeah,
so like that's why I was curious if you actually looked at this because like once they started to build up onto each other, you get this like increased funnel of money coming from the right, then from the left, then from the right,
yeah,
then from the left, and it's actually making worse. So like
yeah.
I want to subscribe to your theory, but at the same time, I also know that there was a lot of money coming into politics from the left as well.
Well, no. I think it fits perfectly with my theory because if you read the introduction of my book, what is a big contributor? My book is not intended to be like and this was something that critics in my book got wrong about it. Both left-wing critics and right-wing critics. My book is not intended to put the blame for the condition of the United States on the right. It's to explain the rise of right-wing populism, which a lot of people have trouble understanding. But what the book is very clear about is that a huge impetus for the explosion in populist discontent with both parties that led to the interest in Perot and the interest in people like Buchanan and David Duke was exactly what you're talking about, which was the perception of the capture of both parties by money and special interests. And I have a lot of discussion in the book of how that's represented in polling in that era and also in the work of intellectuals and journalists picking up on that as a contributor of the right wing and left wing populists or just populists revolt against these things. So I think that's very much in keeping with the perception, which is correct, of a electoral system that was not really responsive to its constituents and only responsive to these groups that were funding it. So yeah, I think that perfectly works with the thesis of the book and is incorporated in it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We'll take one more question. David, you're welcome to add your question in the chat. And if we have time, we will come to you as well. The other
Yeah.
David Kaufman, sorry, both are Davids. Sorry about just because you haven't got the mic yet. So you will be our closing question. So choose well.
A lot of pressure here. But John, I really enjoyed your book.
Oh, thank you so much.
So I was hoping we could phrase. I'm going to maybe pick up on some themes that Todd was touching on. I think when Trump got elected, it sort of was a parlor game. All of a sudden, is to figure out when did this start? Like when did what was the cause point? Well, it was a year ago, it was 5 years ago, it was 10 years ago.
Sure.
I think the great thing about your book was that you show a constellation of events that was very microcosmic of the current time, but you're not saying it all started then either, right? I mean, because you trace back to other points. And I think in some sense what Todd was pointing out, I was going to drew me to an earlier point, than I was going to necessarily focus on, is that, you can look back to the 20, there's so many different points of time, right? I think somebody was commenting about Trump's, that crazy foreign policy they come out with and said, it was basically 1920s isolationism, right? With and other things. But I guess what I've been seeing in your book in terms of the earlier parts, and then so many other really good books coming out. Quinn Slobodian has Bastards and Crack of Capitalism. I know you spoke to Laura Fields recently. Her Furious Minds. I know there's this book, which I forget the title of, the one about the Lewis Powell memo, from plan or whatever.
I forget that too, but yeah.
I guess what I kind of go to is there were strains of this going way back. I mean, to whatever, but there seems to have been the beginnings of the, if you think about how a planet starts to form, right? From all the swirling dust and whatever, that swirling formation sort of started in the 60s around, obviously the reaction to the civil rights movement and the perception that I think people thought, holy shit, they may actually really let, these people in on the game, right?
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the 60s to, Nixon coming in and starting to respond. And then, you really had the end of the Great 30, right? The 30-year glory period when the U.S. just had this huge fucking advantage economically over the rest of the world. it had to come to an end, right? It had to come to,
Right.
and it did. And of course, the neoliberal guys were just chomping at the bit to take advantage of that. And so you sort of had, social forces because nobody really wanted to share. And you had economic forces, right? Because all of a sudden it was going to be totally necessary to screw the middle class to make let the people get what they want. And then you had Lewis Powell writing his memo to kind of show people the way. You had the, I mean, I was an undergraduate at the University of Rochester those days. Basically, they wrote the memo called "The Theory of the Firm," right, which is like basically the cornerstone memo for justifying neoliberal
Right.
profit making, right, forever, right. So that and I just felt like as I look back to read all these books, and I keep going back to like the '60s and this constellation of events kind of coming together and being the kind of I don't know, the sickening moment when it all was probably sort of happening, but we not realized it, right? And I don't know. Am I just and now? Am I imagining that because that's kind of my age? I'm just like for my lifetime, or is there more to it than that?
No, I mean, like, look, there are two different ways to approach this issue. I mean, obviously, he's a mentor to me, and his books are a big inspiration to me, and his interpretation of American history is very close to my heart. Is Rick Perlstein, and obviously, he views the 1960s and 70s as this kind of reaction that's getting steam. He's got the Gathering Storm, and then he has Nixon Land, and then he has the Invisible Bridge about and Reagan Land, and in the 19 the kind of new right reaction that takes place in the 1970s is powerful, and a lot of the people who I discuss in my book really get their start there in the 70s, and many of the things in right-wing populism get their start in the 70s. Now, the other thing I would say to respond to what you were saying is, and putting this into big structural terms, about U.S. prosperity and how long can it last. Yeah, I mean, gotta tell you, I am really more and more convinced by Robert Brenner and what his argument is basically the United States, the destruction of all the capital stock in Europe and Japan in the war was a temporary blessing for the United States.
That's always bothered the hell out of me that people don't. French used to call it the glorious in 30 or something. They actually had a term for it, right?
And that also, the kind of compromise between labor and capital, all this incredible growth, but then what he says is, it's wonderful dialectical picture he makes where, okay, it's a blessing for the United States and a curse for the countries who got the shit bombed out of them. But when these guys build up new capital stock, it's more advanced. They're not stuck with all this old capital like the United States has. So suddenly they start producing with better stuff, with cheaper labor. And the United States, which had this big advantage, finds itself, we can't compete with these guys. Yeah. So there was something always going to happen in the kind of lags that these created. And he thinks that there's this massive, this is very controversial. And I don't pretend to be an economist or economic historian, but as a theory of what I've seen in my own research, when I wrote this book and I saw what was happening in the U.S. economy and what the feelings that were and how it was sort of shaking out politically and culturally, there was a stagnation. Yeah. And there was something not working. And there was all of these efforts to kind of do an end run around this, and what we call neoliberalism, and this and the Volcker shock was one way of doing it, but it never has really gotten over the underlying problem, which is there is an overcapacity. Basically, there's just more capacity than there is demand.
Yeah. I think the data tend to show a lot of, I think Krugman makes this argument, others, there's just a lot, the productivity's had some spurts, but it really hasn't been phenomenal, and wherever it's been going, it hasn't inured to the benefit of the bottom X%, whatever it is. It's stuck there, and all the productivity it's in, it's kind of just accrued to a much smaller level, and you never get away from that, and the capacity question, no matter whether it's the delusions. I mean, I did well during the 90s as a lawyer, but No, it was kind of like a bit of a, people were like having orgasms over it, globalism and technology, right? But I mean, okay.
Well, it was a
Yeah,
good, it
Some
was a
people
good
still
time.
do.
yeah, right.
It
Okay.
was
Well,
a good
or
time to be
your place.
it was a good time to be in services that helped out, a growing economy
Yeah.
of finance and technology.
Right.
So yeah.
It's always so tricky, like what parts of the economy are growing, because sometimes we talk about it in a very monolithic way. And even today, if you look at what sectors are growing, it's like an increasingly small little tip of the economy. John, how generous are you feeling? Are you happy to take one last question?
Yeah, I'll take one last question.
Okay, very brief question, and then we respect everybody's time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Like there's so much interest there. I think people would stay here for like 3 hours if we let them. Maybe they will continue in your Substack chat.
Yeah, please come to the Substack chat. I would be happy to talk to anyone. And or comment on the articles. We have the community on my Substack is very smart. So if you guys, I don't always get to respond, but there are very bright people who will have
That's
really
good.
cool, good commentary on the articles. Yeah.
David, the anchor.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So we talked about Vance. Let's talk about Bannon. You
Oh,
mentioned it before. I think he's sort of the leader of the Brown Shirt Brigade.
yeah.
But I'm curious to get your sense for him as an ideologue because he seems like the most serious and committed of the bunch,
You see?
but he's so hostile to Musk and Teal and sort of the transhumanist. I mean, I mentioned in the chat that I had a lot of friends who were like, I couldn't believe how much I found myself agreeing with Steve Bannon
Yeah.
in that interview with Ross Douthat. And I'm curious, do you think he would reach a point where he realizes there is no going to be any policy to help the working class in MAGA?
Yeah.
And would
Yeah.
he end up turning and supporting a left-wing populist? Can you see a sort of future political constellation where that might happen?
This encore is not a chill song. This encore is like we will end in deep water here. Let's talk about Steve.
I gotta tell you, Steve Bannon, there's always been a question about who is he? Is he a really thoughtful or committed ideologue, or is he a bit of a charlatan and a showboat? And I have to tell you, I mean, you could be both, but I have to tell you, I think that if you watch his show and then you see his performance of his friendship with Epstein and all these people, I think that Bannon is a bit of a political entrepreneur who takes shocking positions in order to wrangle his audience, like many people do today. What kind of constituency he can actually bring with him when he does all these bobbing and weaving, or whether he's just doing it to get in the newspaper and to get attention, I don't know. I don't think he's this chieftain of a faction of the party. Maybe he has some magnetic hold on it. I don't think he's a leader that has a demagogue on the order of Nick Fuentes. So let's say you're right, and Steve Bannon bolts and says, actually, I'm supporting, I don't know, Ro Khanna or whatever now. But I don't think that would be true because he likes Silicon Valley too much. Whatever, you just pick some example. And I'm because he's gonna do the Amari thing. Amari has done a million transformations politically. He's been a Trotskyite. He's did this right-wing populist bullshit. Now he's going back to being a Trotskyite, it seems like. So I don't know. I don't know what his story is. I don't think that Bannon is super consequential anymore. I think that for me, Candace Owens seems to be losing her fucking mind, but I would say that a few months ago. And it's really the big players in the party are Nick Fuentes and who knows who else. Everyone else is sort of on their back foot right now and trying to react to it. You got this neocon rump Mark Levin and Ben Shapiro, and they have an aging group of people interested in them. Bannon, I think, is sort of a subset of the right-wing populists. Then who knows? What is Marjorie Taylor Greene? What's her political ambitions in the future? It seems to me that she wants to run for president. Who does Bannon back? Does he go for Thiel? I mean, does he go for Freudian slip?
Interesting slip. Yeah.
Does he go for Vance, or does he go for Marjorie Taylor Greene, who he's, on his show said a couple times, I don't know if I agree with Trump on this one, or maybe I like her better. So, I think it's really going to be what the primary season looks like, and you're going to see these guys positioning themselves. I don't see Bannon is way too committed to Amari can wash his hands of the racism stuff and just say, I didn't mean it. Bannon, I think, is a sincere fascist. If he's a sincere anything, I think the guy really believes the nationalist, racial, civilizational stuff and the worker stuff is like this. And he doesn't think that they're separable. He's not going to wake up and be like, I'm actually a right-wing social democrat like Amari is. What? Amari, the way he positioned himself, he can say, oh, I was always just kind of a right-wing social democrat. I was always just sort of a conservative social democrat. I wasn't really playing around with that kind of stuff. I don't think Bannon can make that kind of transition. I think he's way too committed to social conservatism. And yeah, absolutely. He's much more racial than Amari was. So yeah, I don't know how important he is, and I don't fully see him making that kind of transition. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Before we log off, do you want to share a couple of thoughts on how you see 2026 unfold? And obviously, these are great tides in the affairs of men, and a lot of people can feel, I understand that even really well-known and highly respected writers can sometimes feel like, I'm just a small person, I'm all alone. What kind of counter force can I exert on this thing? But what would be your prediction? And maybe if we permit ourselves to do that, something that you could advise us to do. I think people voted with their feet when they came here tonight. They could have been binging something on Disney Plus, and instead they are here in this conversation with you. They are clearly dedicated to the topic of democratic health and deliberation. So where is it going, and what can we do?
I mean, look, I think there are a lot of very hopeful things happening right now, and I don't believe in there are forces, and there are powerful forces, but I don't believe in determinism in politics. There's a lot of contingencies that happen and things reverse, and I was not a believer in this vibe shift bullshit. I knew that the time, as soon as these people were elected, the time, like any political movement, was ticking on them, and they were going to be like, very soon they're going to be unpopular with the things they're going to do. So I think, we're entering into a really energetic and interesting period of popular mobilization, and people are very angry, rightly so. And yeah, there are a million different ways to contribute, and whatever you find serves your talents. Some people are great organizers. Some people are better at thinkers and more reflective. Some people are more active, and it's just a matter of where you see yourself fitting into that whole, endeavor. And you don't have to feel bad if you're not. I'm not a good political activist because I'm too reflective, and I sometimes don't have the decisive belief in action that is required of being a politician and of being an activist. So I plugged myself into the thought part of it and the reflection part of the process. And so people have different talents and different skills. Some people do both. I have friends who are historians and they organize. They do labor stuff, or they do political activism in different ways. So I think that it's really a matter of knowing where your talents lie and just dedicated to it. But look, there's going to be plenty. We're about to enter into a big campaign system. There's going to be a lot of campaigns to work on. There's going to be a lot of interesting things going on. And I really think that the counter push to what has happened in the past year is going to be furious and intense and very exciting, and maybe not totally live up to our expectations, but definitely some of the worst things we feared when they were elected. I think it's going to look a lot different. I think that the US public isn't buying it. There's no amount of lying and propaganda in the world that they can do. People are not liking it, and that's going to explode. And I think it's going to be really interesting to watch and to be a part of. It's going to be very exciting. Yeah.
I love that we're ending on this hopeful note. I'm a Tocquevillian, so I definitely trust the democratic immune system of the American public. It has been tested a few times and always somehow triumphed. So I'm here. I'm literally here for it. As here for it as I can be. So let's show it. Let's show what we are capable of. John Ganz, thank you so much for joining us again. You are amazing. I love
Thank you so much.
And the book is fantastic. It's like the answer to why like monocausal explanations just don't work. It's a perfect storm, and this is not the first perfect storm that we've literally weathered. So I'm very happy that there is a way out. And guys, thank you for joining. I loved the conversation in the Zoom chat. Brilliant questions. I want to see you write about this, talk about this, comment on John's famous Substack about this, and let's continue the conversation, because that's kind of the best thing we can do. Nobody can hijack this conversation as long as we are participating.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Everyone. Have a lovely night.
Bye-bye.
Take care. And thank you, John.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.